The Fokker Triplane wasn't just another fighter, it was something the Allies never expected. With its triplane design, it was more maneuverable, climbed faster, and completely changed the rules of aerial combat. But despite the Allies coming up with a solution, one man became iconic as the Red Baron, turning it into a symbol of German air superiority. This is why the Fokker Triplane terrified Allied pilots. When the First World War began on July 28, 1914, no one knew exactly how it would play out. It was the first major conflict of the 20th century, and blitzkrieg tactics were yet to be developed. Both the Allies and Germans relied heavily on trench warfare. This involved digging trenches to set up defensive positions before rallying an attack to storm the enemy. Yet it came at a high cost, with artillery and machine guns often leveling the battlefield and killing hundreds of troops on either side. Unfortunately, aerial warfare was significantly limited, often being used only for reconnaissance missions in the early days. In fact, the only aerial combat would involve a few smiles and waves from pilots looking for enemy positions. This quickly evolved to crews throwing each other with grenades and grappling hooks in the air before exchanging small arms fire and relying primarily on luck. Unfortunately, this proved extremely ineffective, and both sides realized that denying the enemy the opportunity to conduct recon missions would make the difference between winning and losing. The British company Vickers was the first to experiment with adding a machine gun to an aircraft. They exhibited a two-seat biplane of pusher configuration, with the propeller mounted behind the engine to give room for the observer to fire a machine gun. By 1915, the Vickers FB-5 gun bus finally made an appearance on the battlefield as the first aircraft to have an air-to-air armament. In fact, the French Voisin pushers with machine guns were actually one of the first to score a victory against a German aircraft as early as 1914. But the extra weight of an observer and machine gun made it virtually impossible to maneuver. The solution finally came in 1915, and you wouldn't believe how it would change the battlefield. By the spring of 1915, one French engineer, Raymond Saulnier, had come up with a solution. This was in the form of the interrupter gear, or gun synchronizer, as it would later be called. Since the propeller was usually the biggest problem, with pilots initially shooting down their own aircraft, the gun synchronizer enabled them to regulate the machine gun fire to enable the bullets to effectively pass through the blades. Yet the interrupter itself wasn't a new concept, and actually something patented a few years earlier by Swiss engineer Franz Schneider before the war even began. It wasn't until Roland Garros, yes, that's the same man the French Open in tennis is named after, decided that mounting the machine gun atop the fuselage would make aiming easier and enable the pilot to simply point the plane in the right direction and fire. To prevent the plane, which suffered from a hang-fire problem from shooting its own blades, reflectors were mounted, and the whole system was finally perfected and fitted to the Garros Moran L monoplane. He'd go on to down 3 German fighters by early 1915, before being forced to land his aircraft with a ruptured fuel line just a few days later. Garros was taken prisoner, and despite trying to burn the aircraft and prevent it from falling into German hands, the secrets of the interrupter gear were laid bare for the Germans. With information in hand, Dutch aviation pioneer Anthony Fokker stepped up, starting his journey on creating a similar device. He quickly came up with an even more efficient interrupter gear, fitting it to his own monoplane, called the Fokker Eindecker. It immediately reigned supreme in the air over the Western Front after entering service in 1915, but the monoplane design would soon lose its efficacy to the French Nieuport, which mounted its machine gun on the wing. Over the next 2 years, the Germans were significantly more dominant in the skies, with the variations of the Albatros, D-1, D-2, and D-3 series of fighters. In fact, the Arras battlefield became a massive problem for the Allies, eventually leading to it being coined as Bloody April. Yet behind the scenes, the British and French designed far more powerful engines, fitted to the French SPAD and British SE-5. Powered by the Spanish-designed and French-built Hispano-Suiza water-cooled V8, they dominated. But as the Sopwith Camel entered the war, the Germans had to come up with something different. They wouldn't lag behind for too long, and despite the war coming to an end, it was the Fokker in its various configurations that once again transformed the battlefield. So, why were the Allies terrified of it when the Sopwith Camel was similar? When the Fokker Doctor 1 finally made an appearance on the battlefield, it was unlike anything the Allies had seen. It took some of the best features of the Sopwith Camel and thrust it into a triplane that dominated the skies. Its triplane design ensured that it could climb far more rapidly than anything the Allies had, while the maneuverability meant that it could evade Allied aircraft more efficiently. Since dogfighting during World War I mostly involved 2 aircraft flying toward one another and firing, before turning around and making another pass, the Fokker gave the Germans a big advantage. It could quickly change direction to gain an advantage on a strafing run, and when it was chased, the Fokker had good enough maneuverability to turn the tables and get behind any Allied craft. It led to significant losses on the battlefield, but it wasn't without its weaknesses. By the time the Germans had access to the Fokker, they also ran out of money and were slowly beginning to lose the war. It was produced as fast as humanly possible, which meant that weak parts and components were used. In some cases, its wings literally broke mid-flight, sending the pilot spiraling down to the ground. Moreover, it had an underpowered engine that made it slow, especially when it ran out of ammo and needed to flee the battlefield. This led to countless losses when facing large squadrons of Allied aircraft. Then there was the bad design to handling and takeoff, which meant that many of these aircraft often couldn't get off the runway. They either broke or crashed, reducing their efficiency and leading to pilots seeing it as Russian roulette. So why did the Allies fear such a hit-and-miss aircraft? Known in English as Baron von Richthofen or the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen is still considered the ace of all aces. He was credited with at least 80 victories in aerial warfare. Yet, it wasn't the Fokker, as many often believe. It was actually his Albatros D3, with which he scored more than 60 victories, and was first painted red. He'd later score 19 more kills with the Fokker DR1, which many people believe was the aircraft he made famous. The Red Baron would fly with his new Fokker from 1917, which he also painted red, a major difference from the traditional green color of the others in the fleet. In fact, it was this color that made the Allies fear the Fokker, not because of the plane, but because of the pilot. Allies could clearly see the red Fokker coming, which meant that the Baron was on his way, and this often meant death was about to rain down. Essentially, the man became a myth, almost like the White Death a few years later, whose presence was more of a fear than his actual battlefield success. The Red Baron was finally shot down by Arthur Brown, an RAF pilot, on April 21, 1918. Yet debate is still ongoing on who actually fired the shot that took him down. Some claim it might have been anti-aircraft guns, while others claim it was another pilot. But it was an ace pilot named Joseph Jacobs who scored a whopping 30 kills in his Fokker. Jacobs began his career in 1916, flying the Fokker E3 Eindecker. He got his first kill in May of the same year, shooting down a French two-seater Cauldron. But this was only the start. Over the next year, he'd upgrade to the Fokker D2. It was with these aircraft that he made history, destroying half a dozen French fighters, which eventually earned him the Royal House Order of Hohenzollern. Then, in August 1917, he was transferred to the Jagdstaffel 7 as its Staffelführer, or commander, where he'd go on to score one of the biggest victories of the whole war. On September 10th, he came face-to-face with French ace Jean Matten, responsible for downing a handful of German aircraft himself. Jacobs, flying his Albatros, had to overcome the MF flown by Matten in a tense dogfight. Thanks to the superior maneuverability of the Albatros, the MF went down, with Jacobs once again emerging as the victor. Following the victory, he moved back to the Fokker Triplane, where he'd go on to score another 30 combat victories and earn numerous awards in the process. Finally, he was awarded the coveted Pour le Mérite, and as the war came to an end, his total tally, including balloons, stood at 48. Jacobs continued fighting Bolshevik forces in the Baltic area in 1919, before he retired, being added to the Luftwaffe reserves later. Yet when Hitler came into power, he refused to join the Nazi Party, fleeing to the Netherlands, where he went into hiding. But even though the Fokker wasn't the greatest aircraft, it set the stage for some incredible inventions to come. In World War II, fighters such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109 would be just as deadly, but they had a few major problems of their own. Check out this video to find out why.